Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Sterling Live. I'm so excited to be here because we took a little bit of a summer break, but we are back. It is September. We're moving into the rest of 2022. So I'm so excited to be back for another episode of Sterling Live. My name is Caitlin Brower. I don't think any of you forgot about me, but in case you did, I am Sterling's social media manager, and I am your host for Sterling Live. I'm so excited. As you can see, we have two guests with us today right above me here. I'll go ahead and introduce them and introduce the topic for today as well. So today we have Katie Zwetzig, Executive Director of Sterling Volunteers, and she is no stranger to Sterling Live. Excited to have her back. And we have a first-time guest, but no stranger to Sterling Volunteers. We have Beth Steinhorn, President of VQ Volunteer Strategies. Thank you both for joining us today. And the topic we're going to go over is rethinking engagement among disruptions in the volunteer community. So Beth and Katie, I'm going to hand it over to you to introduce yourselves to our audience, give a little bit more about your role, the partnership between Sterling Volunteers and VQ Volunteer Strategies, just giving the audience a little bit more. So Katie, I'm going to go ahead and start with you here.
All right. Well, thank you and welcome everybody. Beth, I have to say I'm so excited to be doing this with you. You and I go way back to, I think, really the start of Sterling Volunteers, and you've been such a great partner to us doing our webinar series and so forth. So like Caitlin said, no stranger. I'm Katie Zwetzig. I'm Executive Director of Sterling Volunteers. Have been here since we launched Sterling Volunteers in about 2013. And our mission is to really build out communities of vetted volunteers and reduce the time and the energy and the barriers to volunteerism. And we do that in a number of ways, some of which you'll hear about today.
I love it. Thank you so much, Katie. And, these volunteer episodes are some of our best. So I'm excited to have you back on. Beth, can you go ahead and introduce yourself to our audience?
Sure. Thanks, Caitlin. And thanks, Katie, for having me as well. I'm president of VQ Volunteer Strategies. Our mission as a company really is to help organizations and their leaders increase impact by leveraging volunteer talent. We do that through strategic planning for volunteer engagement, assessment, coaching, and of course, training. And we're so thrilled to have this longtime partnership with Sterling Volunteers to help provide training on various elements of volunteer engagement strategy to the larger Sterling community. And I'm really excited to be with you all today on this Sterling Live. So thanks.
Thank you. All right. So real quick before we get into it, I want to remind our audience, if you are joining us live right now on Facebook, LinkedIn, or YouTube, and you have any questions for Beth or Katie throughout the episode, please go ahead and post your question in the comment section across all three of these platforms. And I will get the questions over to these two as I see fit throughout the episode. As I said, let's get into it now. We're talking about rethinking engagement among disruptions in the volunteer community. So let's go into disruptions in volunteerism first. Katie, my question for you, and Beth, please chime in, in a little bit. But Katie, what would you say is the current state of volunteerism?
Well, I guess I'm happy to report that volunteerism is back and alive and well. And so what we've seen, mostly for us, it's from the client side. Mm-hmm. Our clients are reporting, and what we're seeing from a activity level is increases back up to the 2019 level of activity. And some clients, most of them are surpassing their 2019 volunteer activity. That said, what we hear from them when we talk one-on-one is that they're having a tough time recruiting and finding volunteers. And that seems to be the state that came out in our research report that we did last year. Points of Light did a research report last year. And from the volunteer side, they said, we're having trouble finding out where we can get connected. So both volunteers and organizations are reporting this barrier in recruiting.
I would agree. I mean, I think I'll just build on what Katie mentioned as I hear across the US and Canada. Volunteers remain motivated by what has driven them to serve for quite a few decades now, which is a chance to make a difference and make things better. But as we've seen in individuals' professional lives as well as their volunteer lives, volunteers seem to be reassessing where and how they're spending their time, where and how they're working, where and how they're engaging as volunteers. And that has left many organizations wondering where the volunteers are and how to reach them. That said, the needs remain great. And so it's really about how do we not only find volunteers, but engage them in ways that will address these ever-changing needs and not ignore the disruptions. We can't go back to the way it was before. So how do we move forward?
Let's not ignore this disruptions. Let's go into them a little bit more. So, Beth, what types of disruptions are we seeing? I know the both of you touched on a couple there, but in more detail.
Sure. Obviously the pandemic, of course, led to significant disruptions in volunteering due to health and safety reasons. Yet, while some organizations put their volunteering on hold for understandable reasons, others were really facing multifold increases in demand for their services and relied on volunteers in order to meet those needs. But we also see a lot of ripple effects from that were varied and really widespread. By summer of 2020, we had a dramatically increased spotlight on racial inequities, and that led to an increased awareness of the inequities in terms of access to volunteering and volunteer opportunities, which renewed a commitment across the field to work in diversity, equity, and inclusion. We saw ripple effects due to the economic impacts of lockdowns, right? Issues like unemployment leading to increased needs for volunteers to help with job placement, job training, et cetera. We saw actually one that often isn't talked about, but I think some interesting, we've in our past year and a half spent some time trying to unpack the increased national narrative around ageism. Older adults were being blamed for the lockdowns, younger adults were being blamed for the spreading of the virus, and that led to some challenges in terms of volunteer engagement, but also some great opportunities for co-generational volunteering in response. And then we also saw continuation of really long-standing trends in shifting volunteer expectations, wanting transformational experiences, not just transactional experiences. And then, of course, there's also organizations that support volunteer engagement professionals and leaders of volunteers, and they really had to rethink, what do leaders need, what's their role, and how could they play a role, which I think makes me ping it back over to Katie, and what were you seeing in disruptions as well, if I can ask you to weigh in.
Yeah, we saw similar. It was interesting for us because part of it was mission-based, like you talked about. The food banks, ramped up their volunteer levels higher than they had been ever. And now they're coming back down to normal, but others, sports organizations and so forth, those are the ones who are particularly above those 2019 levels. What we also saw was it varied by geography. California shut down, some other states did not as much. But what we're seeing now is that everybody's kind of coming back up. There's still some disruptions, though, that I think, you mentioned the economic impact of the pandemic, but even the last Sterling Live that we did a few months ago was with another partner of ours from Meals on Wheels America. And they're just seeing, the impact of gas prices and the economy and trying to get volunteers who will go deliver meals when gas is so expensive. So I still think that there's some challenges to volunteering, Beth, that you hit on where do I want to place my time and energy, and does it also make economic sense for me, and so forth.
Yeah, so a lot to look at there, and definitely a lot to kind of peel back and understand. So we'll get kind of more into what individuals are doing. But right now I want to touch on mindset. So there was a couple of disruptions that you had mentioned, but you also, had tapped in a little bit to, volunteer leaders, corporate things like that. So Beth, I'm curious as to what you're seeing in regards to the mindset of these volunteer engagement leaders, but then also from a corporate engagement standpoint.
Sure. Well, I think that it's a mix of hope and relief on one end of the spectrum. People are excited that they can be engaging volunteers again in person more safely and more regularly, and excited to be doing the core work for which they signed up. But also there's still a lot of exhaustion, let's face it. People are still, a lot of volunteer engagement leaders, it's been a tough couple years. So there's still some exhaustion around that. There's some challenges. And a lot of that is because I think most recognize that even those who are fully reopened or reopening, we can't necessarily go back to business as usual. And a surprising number of organizations are still in recovery mode. I work with a number of museums, and they're only now just bringing volunteers back into the institution and on the floors, and working with the public, for example. Others are working with other volunteer engagement leaders, are working with staffs who, due to the high turnover, have very little experience working with volunteers. And so all of that institutional support that these leaders built up over many years they're needing to rebuild because they have fellow staff members who don't have that experience. On the corporate side, corporate volunteer engagement leaders really also had to pivot. Traditional corporate engagement programs like service days were obviously very challenged, and so they were really faced with the opportunity or the demand to innovate and create new types of programs to engage employees. And now with the shifting expectations of employees, a lot of the policies are needing to shift from many organizations, companies are shifting and broadening from paid volunteer time off to paid social justice and volunteer time off, recognizing that there are a lot of different ways to engage in community, and some companies are really innovating in their policies to honor that. So it's not just traditional volunteer with a food pantry type of hours, but it could be participating in a protest or helping to register voters. Those are important pieces as well.
Yeah, what I love about these episodes when we really go into volunteerism is really understanding that there's so many different things that you can do to go out and be engaged in your community and different ways of giving back. So you just looking at a couple of different areas there, just from an engagement standpoint, bringing up the example of museums. So people are just coming back now to volunteer. A lot of people might not have been thinking that a lot of stuff is opening, but there are some areas that are still closed off, and, developing that open strategy. And then from the corporate perspective, I really liked the adaptation of what does it look like to engage with your community. It's not always that typical, I guess, volunteer like moment in your head. It's things like, going to a protest or helping out with that, or going to help voters, things like really rethinking that and reshifting it. So makes a lot of sense for rethinking engagement among disruptions of what we're talking about today. So we obviously are talking about a lot today, but there is something very exciting we want to talk about, of course. So I won't take too much time here because I want Katie to, really be the one ringing it up. But there's a book coming out, Beth. Ring any bells here, it's called Transforming Disruption to Impact. So Katie, I'll hand it over to you for some congratulations and things like that.
Yeah, so thank you. I got an advanced copy, so I'm reading this. Each chapter is about 2,500 pages and easy to read, and
words, 2,500 words,
not 2,500 pages. You're right. Thanks.
Katie, you just scared our entire audience, thinking that you are some book connoisseur that reads.
Yes, Emily, speed reading dynamics. But no, it was great, and it was fun to read that. And so, Beth, congratulations. I'm curious how this came about.
Thanks. Well, in 2019 and 2020, I had been developing some book ideas and had mentioned it in passing to my fellow volunteers at the National Alliance for Volunteer Engagement, where I sit on the leadership team. And so it had, as I said, I'd mentioned it here and there, but in January of 2021, I published a blog, which I do every month at least. But that blog was inspired by MLK Day of Service, and it put out a call to rethink service days. And a colleague and fellow leader on the National Alliance reached out and said he was really inspired by that challenge, Craig Young, and that challenge to the status quo. And so we began talking regularly about what else did we need to challenge, what other components of the status quo of engagement were being challenged due to the extraordinary circumstances in which we were all living, and what were some of the stories that we could all learn from our colleagues and peers across the country who were engaging volunteers despite the disruptions. not hibernating them. And so after a number of weeks and months of conversations, we ended up forming an editorial team with 2 others as well, myself, Craig Young, Doug Bolton, and Jerome Tennille. In many ways, it's a bit of a start of a proverbial joke, though it's not a rabbi, a priest, and an imam walk into a bar. It was a philanthropist, a consultant, an executive director, and a corporate engagement leader walked into, I guess, a Zoom meeting. And we spent a lot of time talking about how to make the world a better place by engaging volunteers. And a year later, we came out with a book. And it is a collection of essays by about 24 leaders in philanthropy, in corporate engagement, nonprofit leadership, and informal volunteerism as well, who each have a story to share about how they leveraged volunteers, didn't choose to hibernate volunteer engagement, but instead saw volunteers as partners in their ability to sustain or expand impact despite all of these disruptions. So it's kind of like your virtual roundtable with people you'd really love to hear from, and we had the chance to spend 18 months doing that, and now it's in the book. So thanks.
That's one of the things that you just said that catches me every time you say it is just viewing volunteers as partners as opposed to a volunteer program. Can you talk a little bit about that? I think that's powerful.
Yeah.
What I've always said in the many years I've worked in this arena is that there's a difference when organizations view volunteers as a nice to have versus when they view volunteers as core to mission fulfillment. Mm-hmm. And I have a lot of stories and a lot of jargon that, that I could rattle off right now, but I'll say where it really came to a head was summer of 2020, when volunteer engagement leaders were being furloughed or laid off because volunteers maybe couldn't serve in person for some of those organizations, and their leadership said, well, we'll just have to cut that program. That's when volunteers are, something that's nice to have, but not necessary. But for those organizations, like many that we featured in the book and many others, who said, we're in a crisis, and our volunteers are part of our solution. They have talent, they have time, they have networks, and they have a passion for our cause. How can we engage them to help us be nimble and survive, and maybe thrive, but at least survive this? Those are the organizations that view volunteers not just as one little branch on the org chart, but as something that underlies every branch on the org chart from top to bottom and side to side.
Yeah, that's really great. It was a great question, Katie. So congratulations, Beth, on the
Thanks.
book, and to everyone that worked on it. Can you give our audience a launch date? And it looks like Katie already got her copy, but where can other people get their copy on the launch date?
The official release date is November 1st. So pre-sales are available currently through Amazon and Barnes & Noble, I believe, and also through our publisher Amplify. And so you can get yours through that, and I'm sure we can share a link in the comments at some point. But yeah, they're printed, ready to roll, and it'll be in your mailbox on November 1st if you order it. So thanks.
Amazing. And again, it's called Transforming Disruption to Impact. So again, congratulations. And I think we'll pull out a couple more nuggets throughout the show here in regards to the book. But moving on, I think it's a good segue because Katie had asked the question about looking at volunteers more so for partners. I want to touch on the aspects of empathy and feeling connected, and making sure that, the volunteer communities do feel connected at this time. So Beth, has community connection changed? And then is it different for organization staff and the volunteers?
Well, I think that the evolution of the concept of community has certainly changed dramatically for everyone in all aspects of life over the last couple of years, given all of the recent events. When it comes to volunteer communities, I certainly think we need more research, but we have some great research to go on from organizations, as Katie mentioned, like Points of Light and Volunteer Match and IAVE, the International Association for Voluntary Effort, and of course, research by Sterling Volunteers. And what we saw was that between 2020 and 2021, volunteers were even more motivated by the chance to make a difference, but also they really wanted to connect. And so volunteers continue to be driven, in fact, even more so, maybe it's a little bit of a throwback, by this chance to affiliate and be connected. And I heard over and over again from volunteer engagement leaders the question, gosh, we can only be on Zoom, we can only do this, or we have to stand 6 feet apart, or whatever it is. How can we maintain this sense of community among our volunteers? And and it makes me think of some of the stories we gathered as part of this effort. There's a chapter by Cindy Zaghi-Boilo and Lauren Spiro from the MS Society, the National Multiple Sclerosis Society. And in that case, Cindy established a goal of staying connected until we can be together again. And what did that mean on a day-to-day basis? It meant that the CEO was mandating that staff spend time checking in with each other and checking in with volunteers as well. And unbelievably, that was an innovation. Like that mandated community building and time set aside for that is something that wasn't necessarily part of success metrics in 2019, but it has become a big part of success metrics. Katie, what's your thought?
I think, what I was thinking as you were talking is you also have a chapter in the book on community that I thought was really great. And one of the things that stuck out to me was you had at the back end of that chapter some items as far as being intentional about your program and inviting people in, making sure that volunteers and staff are together as a community. But even that process, we work with a lot of clients to define the workflow on onboarding volunteers. And that workflow is important. A background check is important. A training is important to say, you're in, you're welcome, welcome to come on in. And I thought that was really well done.
Thanks. If I can jump in, I'll just say I started my career in museums and as an anthropologist, and people ask me sometimes, whom I knew from that phase of my life, well, don't you miss the anthropology and all of that? And it's all about culture, and I feel like I still get to practice that every day when I work with organizational culture and this idea of building a culture of engagement, building a culture of connection and community. Right? It doesn't happen by accident. We have to have practices in place, name badges, rituals, symbols, and all of those components were challenged amid COVID, but we also have been able to reinvent them in ways that endure.
Yeah, I thought that was really great. Just be strategic about that workflow. Not just technology, but of it, right?
Right.
So moving into empathy, Beth, how does volunteering help develop empathy?
Well, I'll, at the risk of overusing the word, I think it only does it if we're intentional about it, because some many of the challenges that we saw in recent years, or that we shed a light on, are these practices that have been longstanding that in some ways undermine empathy and instead promote a saviorism mentality. But these disruptions really allowed us to release ourselves from some of those old practices, those one-day volunteering events where a group of employees or service club folks, all descend on a community and do something good and leave feeling great, but not necessarily having really developed any empathy or understanding for the community, for the people that they just maybe attempted to help, and how it relates to their life as well. And so two of our contributing authors, Chris Jarvis and Angela Parker, talk specifically about how we can rethink and re-engineer volunteering as a mechanism to nurture empathy. And they didn't use this term specifically, but every time I read their chapter, I think about the best practices in service learning, where in service learning, you bring often students to engage with a community, and it's not just about the action, it's also about learning about the core needs in advance. So there's education, there's action, and then there's reflection. And they really bring that to light, I think, in trying to elevate some of the work around and restructure the work around engaging volunteers to build in that learning and also that reflection piece of what would it be like for this woman in this shelter, or for the people who are benefiting from the food in this food pantry, or how can I serve side by side with them instead of for them. In fact, that's exactly the words that a client of ours with whom we partnered during this time as well, Islamic Relief USA, they took the work they were doing with volunteer engagement and applied it to community engagement, and overlaid a whole new filter on their work, where they asked every time they were partnering with the community, are we working with the community or for the community? And if anything we're doing is really coming from a place of we're working for them, then they need to rethink that. They need to be working with them to identify needs and find mutually appropriate solutions and contribute their assets in that way.
Yeah, I'm really happy you brought that up. And I love your answer because, personally, the best volunteer experiences I've ever had is where they sit you down prior to actually doing the work, doing other things, and they explain to you the why, or they put you in the position of an individual that's going to benefit from the day's work. Those are opportunities that I've gone back to do, because you're absolutely correct. You can be happy at the end of the day of volunteering and feel good about yourself, but it makes it so much more of an experience, and really just, I think brings the whole idea, a little bit further when you understand why, and, building that empathy, like you said. So I'm curious, and I liked the example that you had just used with one of your clients. So it's apparent that, the empathy needs to be built, obviously, but, how are these organizations creating opportunity that are not just putting it out there, but nurturing it for the entire process?
Well, I think that, part of it is about nurturing real meaningful partnerships, and not just looking at one and dones, not having a corporate group or even a nonprofit call a community and say, we want to do something really meaningful in 3 Saturdays and wear matching t-shirts and have a good photo op and, make a lasting impact. It's about really developing a partnership that involves learning on both organizations' part. Also providing time for volunteers to learn. Part of their training might be learning about the root causes and issues that they might be trying to resolve, and then providing reflection time. And if you'll indulge me, I'll just read. There were a couple questions that Angela and Chris posed that were really educational for me in working with them and bringing them into this. They basically say that you want to structure volunteer opportunities so that the participants, the volunteers, leave with answers to these 3 questions. Can you imagine the lives of the people the volunteer experience is meant to benefit? What story will you tell others about this experience once it's over? And what connects this volunteer experience to our group and its purpose? So it really, it starts and ends with the volunteer as well, but it's not self-serving. It's about what can I learn and how can I be different as a result of this effort.
I really like that. So we spoke a little bit about community, prior to talking about empathy. So I want to dive back into community because, over the past couple of years, as, the two of you had mentioned throughout the episode so far, we're redefining a lot. We're shifting. So looking at kind of a hybrid world still from a volunteer perspective. Katie, you had mentioned earlier one of the disruptions being recruitment. So I'm curious, what shifts are you seeing in volunteer recruitment and engagement?
One of the things that we've seen over the past couple of years is, and I think it goes back to what Beth was saying as far as people, volunteer engagement coordinators and managers attriting, is this use of technology. How can I integrate my entire workflow? And that's why that conversation about what is in the workflow, that it's not just technology, but it's also culture, is really resonated with me. But we're seeing a lot of clients more than ever start to integrate. And we have 34 integration partners. I think Sterling has over 40. So a lot of integration conversations going on and a lot of integrations. And that's just streamlining the workflow. So I see that. I see other people just kind of rethinking screening and who gets screened. And especially as people have come back from COVID, a lot of people re-screening their volunteers that were latent over this time and doing bulk uploads and so forth to make sure that everybody's screened before they start volunteering again.
Beth, what are you seeing when it comes to, volunteer recruitment, engagement, that shift we're making right now?
I think that there are a lot of, as Katie mentioned, people are rethinking and giving even more focus to the technology piece, but we also know that, and I predict it will remain the same, that most people volunteer because they were asked. And so it's a question of how do we broadcast that ask? How do we leverage the right people to make that ask? So whenever I talk about recruitment, it's about who is the target audience for this? Who would likely be interested in this type of opportunity? Whom do we know who has relationships with that community? How can we transform one-time volunteer opportunities, episodic volunteer opportunities, into more ongoing ones? How can we focus on the impact messaging and the connection messaging now that we see that that's a bigger motivator? That said, I also think that it's really important to think about what you're asking volunteers to do, and that we need to continue to look with fresh eyes at the roles, the positions, and ask, are they strategic? Just because they worked in 1992, do they work today? Just because they worked in 2019, do they work today, right? How is it structured? And how can we meet the ever-changing needs and availability of volunteers? I think of work with UJ Federation of New York in their employment services arena. Volunteers have been engaged to review resumes. It's online, it's flexible, it's meaningful, and it's discreet, and they know that they made a difference when they helped someone get a job. Pantry volunteers, still really important, but how can we ensure that scheduling is really flexible and self-directed among the volunteers? And then, we mentioned museums, right? How much training is really needed to go out on the floor and work with the public? Does it need to be 2 years of college or graduate level art history, or can it be more about how to engage with the audience and get them to look at art in a new way? And that predates 2020, but more museums are starting to think about that.
Well, it's good to end on the museum, because I was going to bring that up because my next question, it was really good. We didn't plan this at all, people. No, I'm kidding. Because I want to talk about, hybrid, virtual, in-person. And I'm happy you ended on museum, because as we mentioned earlier, they're one of the type of volunteer programs where coming into person is starting now. It's not everything is open. We're still looking at hybrid. We're still looking at virtual. So Beth, have you seen organizations, successfully pivot or grow their hybrid and virtual volunteer programs? And any example, you've provided so many great examples so far, any examples you have on this as well?
Absolutely. I mean, nearly every organization pivoted in some way. Where virtual was possible, they went there, including museums. And many, we have to remember that museums are really multifaceted organizations that don't just engage volunteers as docents, as tour guides. They work in collections, they work in conservation, they work in marketing. And so the Smithsonian Institution, History Colorado, I'm based in Colorado, like Katie is, our statewide history museum and agency, they engage volunteers virtually to help with transcribing archives. And they were able to engage volunteers from all around the world to do that. Osher Lifelong Learning and adult education program certainly shifted for the first time in a really big way from in-person to virtual classes, but they were able to engage volunteers not just as Zoom tutors like a lot of other agencies did, but also as experts to instructors who were expert consultants to instructors who were used to teaching in person and providing mentorship in how to adapt classes to virtual or hybrid presentation. We have up the street in Fort Collins, governments were engaging volunteers virtually. For the city of Fort Collins, Colorado, engaged Virtue Visit and Adopt a Neighbor volunteers, first to help with initial crises of the pandemic, but those have become major programs and strategies across the city to build resilience and connect individuals to services. Others like the Red Cross, they've been engaging a hybrid workforce for decades. And so it wasn't new to them, but they were able to really sort of build that up. And I think that those organizations, obviously, that had a toe in the water through virtual or remote volunteerism before, certainly were able to pick that up, but we can't, now I think we can assume that it's going to be around for good, and those who were previously resistant to virtual or hybrid workforces just need to keep it going because it's a way to tap more people and get more skills.
Well, an opinion question for the two of you as we move into the rest of 2022, moving into 2023 and beyond. Do you think that, virtual, remote, in-person, all of these types of different volunteer opportunities are going to continue indefinitely? Katie, I'll start with you. What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, no doubt. And even, I see that in the work world, right? And there's a hybrid between wanting to work in the office, stay at home, and so forth. And I think the same is true for volunteers. What I've seen is that the organizations that we work with are trying to make it easy to volunteer, partly because they can't find, or maybe mostly because they can't find enough volunteers. I went to a volunteer orientation a couple of weeks ago, and somebody said, well, how often do we have to volunteer? Is it every Tuesday from 2 to 4 and Saturday morning? And they said, nope, pick your own hours. And if you don't show up for 2 years, we're no longer going to send you our newsletter. And I thought, well, that's a difference from 2018 when you had to volunteer every Tuesday and Thursday morning from 10 to 12 or whatever. So I do sense, and Beth may have a comment on that too, that some of these organizations are just trying to find what will work for volunteers and keep some of those hybrid learnings.
I agree. I mean, in a word, yes. I think it's going to stick around. That doesn't mean that everything needs to be virtual. There are still people who want to serve in person, but there are many volunteers who now see the opportunity to engage with causes, even if it's 30 miles away, 300 miles away, or 3,000 miles away, and to do that in meaningful ways. So I think it's here to stay, and yet we also have to remember that paid staff at organizations may or may not, just as managers are still figuring out how to create accountability and create community and good communications among their employees, they need to also be trained and supported in applying those things to the volunteer workforce as well, so that we can not be, this is how we do it with volunteers and this is how we do it with staff, but this is also about creating that strategy where it's one community of paid and unpaid workforce. In fact, the term hybrid workforce prior to the pandemic related in organizations like American Red Cross to paid and unpaid staff working together, not in person and remote. So always evolving.
Yeah, and I would say that, like, if you read that Beth's book and have a lens on this hybrid workforce and that strategy piece, I think it's easier to build community in person. It's challenging to do it on a hybrid, and there's some great examples in the book about how they keep community in a Zoom world. We might have lost Caitlin. All right. So Beth, how about other items that you on how any other items on disruption and stories that you know of?
Sure. I think that some of the key takeaways for me in terms of these varied disruptions and what were some of the solutions. We saw 19 different chapters and stories being told. However, there were some themes that connected all of them. And one certainly was this idea of redefining community. We've kind of talked about that quite a bit. Another was innovation. And to what extent are we really willing to let go and release ourselves from the tyranny of how we've always done things, and certainly these disruptions gave us permission to do that and rethink. Jerome wrote a great chapter on how, he had been proposing changes to service days in the corporate engagement world and had been told no, but of course by 2021, MLK Day of Service suddenly like, yes, let's do some virtual learning. And then there's also leadership development. How do we look differently, and where do we look differently to find leaders? How do we partner with informal volunteers in our communities? And what's the leadership role of the volunteer engagement professional in the community? We also looked at investment. Who's willing to invest in volunteer engagement from a funder perspective and even from an organizational leadership perspective? Because let me dispel this myth. Volunteers are not free. It takes an investment to engage them strategically. And the last couple of years shook up that model and began to open some folks' eyes. And then finally, there's that piece about volunteers really wanting a transformational experience. And I think that relates back to one of our earlier comments about empathy, that they want to not only transform and make a difference for the community, but they want to leave different as well. And how can we continue to create and nurture those opportunities? So those were some of the themes we saw coming out of these multiple disruptions.
Yeah.
Welcome back, Caitlin.
Thank you. It was just on brand. We were talking about disruptions. Of course, some type of technology disruption was going to happen. But you guys, I heard you the whole time, even though I wasn't there. You guys did it flawlessly. So
we're not quite as smooth as you, though, Caitlin. Not quite.
It was perfect. All right. So I want to go into our last area of the episode here. So listen, building trust and safety among nonprofit organizations, it's a great asset, and it's the people that serve their mission. At Sterling, we're looking at, a lot of things around, it's all things about people. It's trust and safety. So with that little kind of precursor there, I actually want to hand the mic over to Beth. And Beth, I know you might have a question or two for Katie. So.
Yeah, I would just love to hear what you've seen from a Sterling perspective. How have all these disruptions driven change around not just views of community and connection, but trust and safety? There's a lot of talk about trust or lack thereof in the national dialogue, but how let's bring it to this, service arena. What are you seeing as a ripple effect in terms of your work at Sterling?
Yeah, well, certainly trust and safety, those two words are a core of Sterling's values, but even taking it up a notch from a sector standpoint, I think what we tried to do was build trust with our community. And largely what we saw was a hunger for content. And Beth, you played a part in that. So, we have these webinar series. Beth runs most of those, and, attendance is great. So we tried to, pull in and keep that engagement and conversation going through that way. What we see from if I dive into screening, what we see, back in 2020, we did have people that were, trying to get grants. So their funding dried up. So all of a sudden the grant writers were very, very busy, and some changes in screening tactics, mostly in the fingerprinting world. So we pivoted and offered fingerprinting. But we did have conversations on, hey, my budget is only this big. I can't screen all my volunteers. So how do I screen them, and what's the best way? And those conversations were great. And I think we kept people through that period still screened. We offered free background checks to nonprofits across the board. If you had volunteers to screen, we do it for free. So our mission was, let's get people screened and have this trust and safety. And now, as I mentioned, as we'll come back, they're screening at the high levels that they were pre-2019. And that trust and safety is really a key.
Thanks.
Yeah. Any other questions, Beth, that you have for Katie, or maybe your thoughts on what she had to say?
Well, I think it's, I think that it echoes what I'm hearing in the field. I hear a lot of organizations not questioning the need to ensure that there's trust and safety. And obviously all sorts of many of the circumstances of recent years added extra layers to that, health, safety, et cetera, it didn't exist before. And they're also working to balance that against budgets, as Katie mentioned, and an increased desire to create accessibility. And so how can we ensure that volunteer opportunities are accessible and easily easily launched. And I think, that's about streamlining systems so that for the roles for which background checks are really important and vital, that they can do that quickly and efficiently, thoroughly, and get to action as quickly as possible.
Right. I mean, we could spend an entire Sterling Live on horror stories, what we've uncovered in background screening. Even in our monthly updates that we do, we see quite a substantial hit rate. So people who have been screened really thoroughly first, and then, while they're with the organization, they're still getting arrested. But, back on the recruiting and your comment on, how we partner and so forth, we are looking at how we can help the recruiting. So if you think about Sterling Volunteers and our millions of vetted volunteers, still vetted because they get these monthly updates, how can we help them find opportunities through our partnerships with many of our VMS partners? And so kind of an exciting time for us, and hopefully more to come on that.
That's great to hear. And that is definitely exciting for sure. All right. So at this time, if you are watching live on Facebook, LinkedIn, and YouTube, thank you so much so far for watching, tuning in here. If you have any final questions for Katie or Beth, please go ahead and pop them into the comment section across all three of these platforms. This is your final call for questions. As we wait for any final questions to come in, I want to give the two of you the opportunity to share your final thoughts around the episode, maybe something you haven't brought up already, just whatever you want to leave our audience with. So Katie, I'll start with you on your final thoughts for today.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it goes back to what I already said about the book. I think if you read the book and the chapters, the 2,500 word chapters, then with a lens of hybrid or a lens of how do I onboard volunteers in various lenses, there are some really incredible nuggets, even, for me, a non-volunteer manager. So I love that. I loved, Beth, when you said something about instead of volunteer engagement, and I know that they're not the same, but community engagement. How do I, as me as a volunteer in my wonderful city of Fort Collins, Colorado, how do I look at community engagement instead of just what am I doing as a volunteer? So I think that there's nuggets and great learning, and certainly appreciate our partnership over the years, Beth.
Thanks, Katie.
Beth, final thoughts from you.
Yeah, well, thank you, and thanks to everyone who joined, and again for the great partnership with Sterling, between Sterling and volunteers and VQ Volunteer Strategies. For me, there are lots of little tactics that we've touched on, and great case studies, little examples to be inspired by. But to me, the biggest takeaway of all of this is not letting the opportunity, for lack of a better word, to look at these disruptions as a way to give us permission to leave behind practices that no longer serve us. I've said, even this afternoon, it gives us permission it releases us from the tyranny of the way we've always done things. And so, we need to be sure that we're not going back to everything the way it was back in 2019, but that we also aren't throwing all those good practices out either. This isn't about embracing all virtual volunteering and leaving behind in person, but how can we sustain some of the elements of the innovation and also reclaim those great things that were driving us to mission fulfillment before all of these disruptions began to be unleashed. And when we engage volunteers as our partners strategically, not just as a program, then we position ourselves to be more nimble and ready to face whatever disruptions are around the corner, which we, sad to say, we know are inevitable. So how can we learn from these innovations and these partnerships and equip us to sustain and keep going, regardless what tomorrow brings?
At this time, we don't have any further questions coming in through social media, nor do I have any final questions for the two of you. This was a phenomenal episode. So much information for our audience to digest, and really, really important information for sure. I want to personally thank the two of you for joining me today. I absolutely loved our conversation and discussion. Thank you to our live audience on Facebook, LinkedIn, and YouTube, and those who catch the episode on demand later. We do have a couple of hellos coming chiming in on LinkedIn. Hello. And yes, unfortunately, goodbye. No, but it really was great. So for Sterling volunteers at any time, you can go sterlingvolunteers.com and also vqstrategies.com as well to get further information. You can connect with Beth and Katie. And real quick, Beth, I want you to sign off on the launch date of the book again and where you can get it, just for everyone to know.
Thank you. Release date is November 1st, and it can be pre-ordered on Amazon or ordered today at Amplify Publishing. And I appreciate everyone's interest. Thanks so much.
Of course. And thank you both again for joining me. And I hope everyone joins us on the next episode of Sterling Live.
Thank you.
Thanks.